This is Michael Jackson's controversial song, They Don't Really Care About Us. It talks about racial inequality, police brutality against blacks, and the civil rights champion Martin Luther King. And it's still relevant today. Here's how. With the Civil Rights Act of 1968, legal forms of racism were abolished, but it didn't actually end racism in the U.S. It's not only about forced segregation or slurs or lynching. Professor David T. Wellman defines racism as, quote, culturally sanctioned beliefs, which, regardless of intentions involved, defend the advantages whites have because of the subordinated position of racial minorities. So, let's talk about institutional racism. It's what blocks access to opportunities for people of color. Professor Tricia Rose identifies 5 social institutions that produce and keep racial inequalities going, either intentionally or unintentionally, through housing, education, criminal justice system, media, and wealth. Housing disparity leads to low taxes, which leads to poor schooling, which leads to low education and dropouts and blacks entering the criminal justice system. And because of the media and prejudice, they receive longer sentences and can't get jobs when they're finally released, which leads to poorer communities, which leads to housing disparities, which leads to... You see the cycle there? So let's start at the top. Today, the average white family owns 700% more wealth than a black family. A study by Brandeis University found that this disparity is due to the institutionalized racism in housing. You see, for decades, the Federal Housing Authority wouldn't grant mortgage loans to people of color. They'd rank all the neighborhoods in the country according to their loan eligibility, and black neighborhoods were marked red and assigned the lowest grade. Later, this rating system was taken up by banks and other institutions which denied home and business loans to people of color. This is called redlining, and although it's now illegal, the damage is still being felt today. Blacks couldn't get loans to buy property in their neighborhoods, and white real estate owners known as blockbusters held all the deeds. Without access to loans, black neighborhoods couldn't thrive. Homes weren't renovated, new businesses weren't opened, and existing ones weren't being expanded. It's what created ghettos and generational poverty. Lower property values and the lack of prospering businesses meant that local tax collections were low. With nearly half of a school's budget coming from local taxes, education in these areas suffered. And when schools don't have enough funding, they can't open kindergartens or hire qualified teachers. So class sizes swell, and schools don't offer electives and upper AP classes. This education system not only fails students of color through inadequate resources, it also creates a school-to-jail track. Looking at statistics on suspension rates from kindergarten through high school, black kids are suspended and expelled from school far more often than white kids. Expelled students have a higher chance of being arrested or ending up in juvenile detention centers, where they're introduced into the criminal justice system, which again is skewed against people of color. The number of black convictions are much higher than white convictions for the same crimes. Black people make up only 13% of the U.S. population, but they're 40% of the U.S. prison population. Why? It's all about perception. Black people are perceived as criminals, and this stereotype of black people as brutes became especially popular in 1915 with the movie The Birth of a Nation, praising the Ku Klux Klan's protection of white women from the sexual aggressions of free black men. The movie was screened at the White House, and President Woodrow Wilson reportedly said the film was, quote, like writing history with lightning, and its depictions were all so terribly true. And these perceptions have carried on. Interestingly enough, the U.S. prison population skyrocketed after the Civil Rights Act, mostly caused by the U.S.'s war on drugs, which, according to former Nixon advisor, was created to target black communities and hippies. And today, even though whites and blacks use drugs at similar rates, people of color are far more likely to be prosecuted and receive harsher sentences for non-violent drug-related crimes. Only 13% of drug users are black, but 36% of people arrested and 46% of people convicted for drug-related offenses are people of color. At the current rate of arrests, 1 out of every 3 black males will go to jail at some point in their lives. And when they get out, they'll earn 21% less in wages than formerly incarcerated white people, which feeds into poverty, which feeds into housing, which feeds into schools, which feeds into prisons, which was fed by the media, and round it goes. 66% of the overall population and 70% of the white population think racism is individual rather than being built into laws and institutions. What do you think?